Hello everyone, welcome to UMD Media. UMD Media works on understanding, measuring, and doing. We are live now on Facebook and YouTube. Those who are following us live, please share, subscribe, like, so that many can access our material. Today we'll be having a conversation with Rashid Abdi on the middle power countries in the Horn, Tigray as a lens. Rashid, welcome to UMD Media again.
Thank you very much, Gatecho.
Great. Today we'll be talking about middle power. I don't think many people talk about middle power. I mean, those who listen to us would like to know what the middle power countries are. But before that, I want to just bring why I brought you here. This is your profile on Twitter, where it says Horn of Africa, Gulf. So these are the two keywords that we want to connect today. And interestingly as well, in finding the pathway to the Gulf, middle power countries and the Horn, I saw here at Sahan, where you work, pathfinders in policy and practice. I think by the end of the show, I'm hoping that myself and our viewers would have this path to what's happening in the Horn vis-a-vis middle power countries. I want to start with the number of reports that are coming out on this topic. So this is from the Danish Institute of International Studies, where they look at the Horn, and we'll be talking about that shortly. And this is, I think, a year old almost. So this is talking about, again, geopolitics in the Horn and the Gulf. Just recently this month, from the Munich security brief, Horn of Dilemmas. And I like this terminology. I want you to speak to that later. A geopolitical traffic jam. It's talking about the Horn and so on. But what attracted me is these Zach Vertins from the Brookings Doha Center. This is June 2019. Again, talking about the Gulf, the Horn, and so on. And that brings me to your contribution to the same topic in a panel in Brookings Center, in Doha Center. I just want to start with that short clip.
Magnified also the bigger problem. The Horn of Africa, as everyone knows, is one of the most unstable corners of the globe. Historically conflict prone, with probably one of the largest human displacement crises in the world. About 70% of the world's global displacement crisis is actually in the Horn. You have millions of populations that have moved across the borders, but also internally, you also have a growing internally displaced persons crisis. Just to give you an example, a country like Ethiopia, for example, now has close to 2 million of its own population internally displaced. And that tells you a great deal about how unstable this part of the world is. And I think apart from this displacement crisis, you also have transitions that are contested, transitions that are highly unstable, I will take that example as actually, a country like Ethiopia, the transition underway in Ethiopia.
This is in February 2020. So, given what you were talking about at that time, maybe not the specifics, but in general, what does the profile of the Gulf, the Middle Power, and the Horn of Africa looks like now compared to what you saw at that time, Rashid?
Yeah. I think the first thing, first of all, thank you very much, Gatecho, for inviting me to this forum, and also my appreciation to you and the media, which I think is doing fantastic work to bring clarity to some of the hot issues in the Horn. The Horn and the Gulf are two regions that have historically been interconnected. Centuries of interactions, commerce, and the whole ecosystem of the Horn and the Gulf are very much interconnected. And whatever happens across the Red Sea has an impact on the Horn, as well as what happens also in the Horn has an impact in the Gulf. I think also you have seen how in recent years, at least in the last 10 years, you have seen assertive new powers in the Gulf emerging, making themselves more visible in the international stage. And this is largely to do with the fact that these are also ambitious economic powers. They are very wealthy. Some of them have military ambitions. They are also seeing a very huge geopolitical shift where you have an America and a West that is retreating from the region. And so they are feeling a sort of a void that is emerging in leadership. And they do not have a blueprint to destabilize the Horn. Let's remember that. What they are doing essentially is to try and play this geopolitical game the same way also the bigger powers have played this geopolitical game during the Cold War and beyond that. Building clientelist relationships, building vassal states that are subservient to you. This is nothing new. Throwing weapons into a conflict zone. These are the same things that have happened in the Cold War as well. So I do not want to give an historical impression that what we are seeing is new. But I think the difference, of course, with the Cold War and what we now have now, essentially is that, first of all, you have a proliferation of actors. So you have multiple actors, all of them engaged in this very intensely heated geopolitical competition, as well as military competition, especially for the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. During the Cold War, you had basically a bipolar world where you had the US and the USSR. And so there was clarity. You had at least some kind of a code. You also had contacts between the two powers. They had a hotline, discussing every time things got out of hand. They will call each other at the highest level, meet. They also regularly engaged in de-escalation. So what you have now, essentially, is a free-for-all, where assertive middle powers are emerging. All of them are building these military footprints across the Horn, but also using the Horn essentially as a testing pad for their weaponry. And I will come to the specifics, but just to lay out, I think, the bigger ideas is that so what you now have is actually very dangerous because you do not have clarity on the rules of the road. You do not have mechanisms for actually engagement. The Saudis created what they call the Red Sea Forum, but we haven't seen any action to really bring major discussions of this. The AU and the IGAD have been engaged in a process of building mechanisms of dialogue between the Gulf and the Horn. And the purpose was to try and de-escalate and also find ways in which geopolitics is not a realm of confrontation, but a realm of cooperation. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened. And as I said, the fact that you now have multiple actors engaged in a very small corner of the globe, throwing all their resources, and there is no mechanism, it becomes extremely dangerous. And Ethiopia is a classic example of what could go wrong. Here is a state in the midst of a civil war, and you have three big players in Middle East throwing weapons and changing the military dynamics in the field in order to give one side victory and deny the other side victory. Um, it's not, again, as I said, it's not something that hasn't happened in the past. History is full of examples of big powers or middle powers engaging in conflict. But what I would like to communicate is that this competition now and the fact that you have three big players engaged in Ethiopia's conflict is hugely destabilizing, and it is undermining, I think, the prospects for peace.
Mm-hmm. We'll come to Ethiopia a bit later. So maybe in terms of the timeline, you were mentioning that, yes, this has been happening everywhere, back in time. But for the Gulf region, I think there are maybe a couple of timelines we can talk about, right? 2015, maybe 2011, and then 2017. Uh, Talking about 2017, you wrote this A Dangerous Gulf in the Horn. This is August 3rd of August 2017, your article, How the Inter-Arab Crisis is Fueling Regional Tensions. So, and 2 years before your article, for example, in terms of UAE, I think, got the 30 years lease of Assad port in Eritrea and maybe Hanish Island as well. So can you paint a picture for us in terms of the timeline when things try to change in the Gulf, in the Arab Peninsula, then the magnetic horn try to attract these forces, and how?
Yeah. I think it is good you reminded us of that I think piece which I wrote in July, at least many years ago, when there was this emerging crisis in the Middle East between the state of Qatar and its neighbors, the Saudis and the Emiratis, and there was an escalation, and we had this huge crisis in the Gulf, which pitted the two sides against each other. And we knew that this rivalry was going to spill over into the Horn of Africa, as I said, because of that historical linkages and connection between the two regions. Now, even before the crisis erupted in July 2017, the Horn and the Gulf were interacting, as I said, for decades. And there was a conflict actually underway at that particular time, which was the conflict in Yemen. The Yemen conflict created, I think, a very big dilemma for some of these Arab powers, especially Saudi Arabia and also the Emirates. Because, again, it was a proxy conflict in which the rivals of the two Arab powers, Iran was also involved actually in the conflict by supporting the Houthis and giving them drones. And so this conflict had become a vicious proxy battle between two major Middle Eastern powers, or two blocks of the Middle East, which was the Iranian bloc and also the Saudi Emirati axis. Now, the conflict created actually a military need to actually gain more foothold in the Red Sea. And the facilities in Assad, as well as later some kind of an agreement that allowed the Emiratis also to begin conducting aerial attacks using the southern flank of Yemen, created, I think, the need also to control these sea lanes. So the military need to control or again military footprint in the Red Sea created that need. Then there's also, I think, another important dimension, which is the fact that many of these Middle Eastern powers are also modernizing. They are changing their economies. They are looking towards a post-oil future. I'm not too sure that they are doing that very strategically, but one of the arguments which they make is that they need to diversify away from oil and to, first of all, secure they basically gain enough food stocks. Remember, the Gulf is entirely dependent on imports for food, and so they look towards a country like Ethiopia, with abundant land, with heavy rainfall throughout the year, arable land, potential for agriculture, and they see a breadbasket. So that explains why there is an interest in a country like Ethiopia. But also they're interested in a country like Somalia, for example, where you have the potential for building ports. And the Emiratis have built, have basically shown a great interest in creating these new ports along the Somali coast. I think the most prospective and the one that has gained a lot of serious attention and probably investment is Berbera. And once Berbera is up and running, who will be the greatest, economy that will benefit from Berbera? Certainly not Somalia. It is Ethiopia, the largest, market, a country with huge, over 100 million population. So the Emiratis are not just investing in Ethiopia to keep Abiy in power. They are also they want to secure their Berbera investment, and so this explains why they are. I'm not too sure that it is very strategic to support, a government rather than the state, which is Ethiopia. But it's probably not best to go discussing this in greater length. But all I want to say is that the Emiratis are probably conflating two things, which is Ethiopia as a state that will need Berbera, and Abiy as a government who needs Berbera. Actually, Prime Minister Abiy has shown very little interest in Berbera. He, of course, hasn't pulled out completely, but he's kept at least the Somalilanders in the dark. And largely because I think he has not made a strategic decision to actually shift some of the traffic to the port of Berbera. So I just wanted to, I think, highlight a point which you raised, Getachew, which is that this is not just a military contest or a projection of influence and power. It is also commercial. It is related to ports. It is about hinterland economies. It is about a post-oil future. It is about all these things put together. It's not just one simple factor which is driving the middle powers in the Horn of Africa.
Interesting, yeah. So in that, what is interesting for me was in that article from you in 2017, there was a mention of what Ethiopia said at that time. Actually, it's interesting to share because at that time, Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn was in power. Yeah, and he specifically mentioned the Gulf crisis and the fear and with Eritrea and so on. Of course, we will know that a year later, things will totally change. But it's worth commenting on that. So this is a quote from your article where Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn publicly articulated his country's anxiety on 7th of July. This is about the Gulf crisis must be resolved and all that and so on. But he mentions that Gulf states' increased military presence, reflecting his country's fears that an emboldened Eritrea, which plays a pivotal role in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi's regional strategy, could use this as an opportunity to boost its military capacity. So this is August 2017. Fast forward to where we are now, or the last year and 1 month. did you see, was it easy to see where the Horn was going? Or is it something that we just, wait and see and read the current situations? What was your take at that time in terms of where Ethiopia was, where Eritrea was? And we knew by then Assab is already under UAE, and we knew, like you mentioned, Berbera, Bosasa, all these ports in Sudan, Somalia, were being either leased, contracted out to the Gulf countries.
Mm. Geopolitics is always very fluid, very complex, constantly shifting. And so what prevailed last year may not prevail today. There was a fundamental, I think, realignment in the Horn after the outbreak of the rivalry between the Emiratis and the Saudis on one side and the Qataris on the other. And that was in July. And we saw in particular how that geopolitical crisis had an impact, especially domestically in Somalia, where there was a divergence of opinion between the federal government based in Mogadishu and the regional federal states, who had a different view and who took a completely different approach towards their relations with the Gulf. And so Eritrea, interestingly, was much more because, again, it had these strategic relations with the Arab world for a longer time. It had these basically profited from these geopolitical tensions in the Middle East. First of all, by showing its military utility, renting out Assad, as also deploying actually troops to Yemen as well to fight on the side of the Emiratis. Sudan and Eritrea are the countries that actually deployed troops to Yemen to support the Saudi Emirati coalition. We know it's very unclear how much, but we know for a fact that the Eritreans receive annual fees for some of the work which they do for the Arab world. And so Yemen conflict actually led to a very important geostrategic enhanced the geopolitical profile of Eritrea. So Eritrea actually benefited from that conflict. So the alliances continue to shift. Just to give you an example, Qatar has very strong influence in Somalia, but does not have that influence in Ethiopia. The Eritreans and the Ethiopians generally regard the Emiratis as strategic allies. But then the irony is that, of course, all these three countries are part of a tripartite alliance. And so this is just one example to show to you that also the Horn is capable of building its, or rather building its own relationship with the Horn without necessarily following the script, if you see what I mean. These countries are also counter-manipulating. So in other words, let's not get this impression that the relationship between the Gulf is one of master and slave. It's about only one party asserting its authority on one party. It is actually a game of manipulation and counter-manipulation. And this is the nature of geopolitics. It's nothing new. But to, I think, highlight, we are seeing at least key realignments splitting along the Qatar, Turkey, which we haven't mentioned, but Turkey is probably a much bigger strategic player than even the Arab states. And for the simple reason, the Turks are a bit more sophisticated technologically. It is a middle-income state with vast industrial as well as technical know-how, scientific know-how. They have rapidly built a range of drones that have completely changed military dynamics in the Mediterranean, in Libya, in Central Asia, and now, as we see, in Ethiopia. This is all a big profile for the arms industry in Turkey. And this isn't new. The Western powers are big arms sellers as well. So to indicate, to mention this fact is not as we I'm picking on the Turks, but just to highlight that the Turks are, but first of all, an assertive middle power. They are also now a technological power. They also have a government that is increasingly authoritarian, wanting to build these authoritarian systems as forms of influence, geopolitical influence. And that explains why Erdogan, the president of Turkey, gravitates naturally towards big men of the Horn, Isaias Afewerki, Mohammed Abdullahi Farmajo of Somalia, as well as Abiy Ahmed of Ethiopia. It is a club of big men supporting each other, mutual regime survival. This is what is driving also this competition. And that's why I said it is extremely dangerous, because it induces conflict, it aggravates conflict, and it is very, I think, detrimental towards also conflict resolution.
I'm glad you mentioned Turkey, because one thing that we saw, be it in Libya or even in Azerbaijan and Armenia, Turkey and UAE were on opposite sides of the conflict. They were supporting, opposing factions. But when it comes to Ethiopia, it looks like they are working, at least they're supporting the same side. So to your point of geopolitics is just fluid, it goes any direction, any time. So with that in mind, what is Ethiopia now offering to all sides? I don't know where Qatar is here, but what's Ethiopia right now offering in this conflict that, for example, where Tigray cannot offer, as a sub-state or sub-regional state?
I'm glad, Getachew, you mentioned that factor about how modern, at least the kind of middle power competition we are seeing, is also pragmatic. It is based on coming together around certain geopolitical spots where where their interests converge. Now, the Emiratis and the Turks had a big fallout in Libya. In Libya, the Turks were supporting the government, which is based in Tripoli, whereas the Emiratis were backing the rebel Khalifa Haftar. And so when Khalifa Haftar was actually very close to taking over Tripoli, the Turks intervened, deployed the Bayraktar TB2 drones, and then pushed back Haftar and quickly changed the military game in Libya. We see the same pattern repeated by the Turks also in Ethiopia. Remember, the Tigrayan defense forces got up to Debre Berhan, which is roughly 200 kilometers north of Addis. This was where the TDF vanguard units were actually pushing towards. I don't want to say that the reason was largely because of the drones, but just to simply highlight how these lethal drones are also capable of actually reversing battlefield gains. So the Emiratis and the Turks had a falling out in Libya, but in Ethiopia, their interests converge because all of them realize that Ethiopia is the largest economy in the Horn of Africa, fasting. It's also potentially one of the most interesting economies. If you are a strategic minded, this is a country where you will be looking towards. It also has a huge labor force, has a young population, has the potential, as Meles realized, of becoming an economic powerhouse of the Horn. So they realize all those factors. And remember, if the Emiratis are interested in building ports in Somalia, you build a port because you want to connect it to a hinterland economy. if you don't control the hinterland economy, then your port investment cannot be viable. And so this explains why the Emiratis are not just interested in building ports, but they are also interested in actually building influence in hinterland economies. And this explains the strategic logic of actually building this influence in Ethiopia, and largely by allying themselves with Prime Minister Abiy. So you're right, this factor must never be forgotten. This is not an ideological convergence of interest. This is not even a long-term convergence of interest. The Turks and the Emiratis have deep fundamental differences over a whole host of places. But today, the irony is that the Emiratis are paying in checks for drones from Turkey, which will be used in Ethiopia. And that is a very interesting, I think, geopolitical, development, which we haven't seen also in the past. But also, remember, geopolitics is largely a marriage of convenience, and that is why I'm confident that the longer this crisis continues, the greater the possibility of actually that alliance also unraveling. Remember, there is also a lot of pressure domestically on Turkey itself. Its economy is in serious crisis. The president is under siege. There are actually growing calls for him to resign. There is even a prospect that if the crisis escalates, we may even have a coup in Turkey, and that can completely change what we now see on the ground in Ethiopia. So just to highlight that a lot of what we are seeing are not permanent. They are impermanent, and they can completely change, very quickly.
Interesting, yeah. There is one factor you mentioned. It's not one factor, one direction, and one time, right? So commercial interest, military interest, security, all that. But also you mentioned that there is no blueprint for purposely, destabilizing Ethiopia and so on. One thing that you mentioned, Mellis, that reminded me of this what he said 11 years ago. But this source is saying 10 years ago because this was written last year by Alex Doll, I guess. So this is where he was talking about his nightmare. My nightmare is that we should have an Egyptian agenda financed by Gulf money. So I'm just bringing this, and where is Egypt here?
Yeah,
we have seen
again. It is a good question.
Yeah.
Egypt has had very difficult relationship with the Abiy government in last 4 years. They tried very hard, actually, when Abiy emerged, to actually rebuild the relationship. And I think there was that famous trip Abiy paid to Cairo, where a lot of warm things were exchanged, and there was actually a thinking at that time that among the Egyptians, at least, this is a man they could probably do a deal with. And also remember, Abiy Ahmed also carries an Islamic name, and so these also his cultural roots, all these made him look like the kind of leader that the Arab world could probably do a business with. Unfortunately, things didn't pan out that way, and first of all, the domestic crisis in Ethiopia escalated, and the president began to see these countries, needed foreign enemies. And I think, as you probably know better than me, in times of great crisis, Egypt is a very easy name to pick from the shelf and say Egypt is destabilizing, Egypt is doing this. I think the Egyptians will probably desperately need a deal on the Grand Renaissance Dam more than they will need a destabilized or a nation in conflict or unravels or disintegrates. I don't think that is a strategic goal of Cairo. They probably want at least some kind of a semblance of a government which can manage the resources of the Nile, rather than no government, chaos, and no deal. That is not in the strategic interest. So I think I will question the assumption by Abiy and his supporters that part of the crisis that is ongoing in Ethiopia is being caused by an Egyptian agenda. I think Egypt, would probably will not strategically mind if Ethiopia is in crisis, but at least will not want, I think, that country to unravel, or will not want to see that destabilization impact the negotiations over the Grand Renaissance Dam. They probably want a credible government in Addis, which is able to cut a deal over the Grand Renaissance Dam. That's how I'll characterize it.
Thank you. Talk about Tigray. There is a feeling that the Tigray Defense Forces, the generals, the political leadership, they have maybe at least a couple of times misread what could come, supporting Ethiopia, supporting Abiy Ahmed, and so on. So, what is your feeling of their reading, their analysis of who would come to in support of Abiy Ahmed and so on? Do you feel the same? Like they have misread, they have miscalculated the power of drones, the power of these powers that were coming together to support Abiy?
I think, first of all, it's probably too early to make a very definitive assessment of why the Tigrayan defense forces retreated. I have seen a lot of analysis and a lot of speculation, but I think we should wait and see how developments proceed in the coming days. First of all, there was a very intense pressure that was exerted on the Tigrayans not to push into Addis by the Americans, but also by Kenyan government. Both countries have been intensely negotiating and talking to all the sides. And the pressure has been more actually on the Tigrayans than on Abiy. And the logic is that if the Tigrayans push out from the areas they control in Afar and Amhara and retreat into Tigray, then they can make a better case for the lifting of the siege. And so the retreat of the Tigrayans, the TDF, is not exclusively a factor or a function of the drone strikes. Yes, the drone strikes did considerable damage on especially the infantry and as well as the armored divisions of the TDF. They slowed them down because, again, when you are coming down Kombolcha, Desi and Kombolcha, this is a steep downhill slope. It's not as mountainous as the highlands. It is, if you are using the highway, then it becomes extremely easy for drones to pick you out and basically dismantle your fighting vehicles. And that is essentially what happened. And so there could have been, it is quite conceivable that the Tigrayan command did not anticipate the ferocity of these drone strikes and how they will impact the military operation. But I think to just use one factor as the drones as simply a game changer in Ethiopia is too early. I think international pressure played a bigger role, much more than the drones, in actually forcing the Tigrayans to relook at their military strategy. And I think there's an important element which is also worth highlighting. If you are faced with two choices, to see millions of people starve or to continue a military campaign, which is open-ended, which is uncertain, what would you do? The choice is very clear that at a certain moment, the Tigrayan leadership sat down and said, we wanted battlefield gains, and we wanted to actually see changes in Ethiopia. But if that comes at the cost of killing or destroying millions of Tigrayans who cannot have food, then we need to reevaluate. This is a very tough choice This is not a conflict that is classic military confrontation between two powerful sides. It is actually a battle between a federal army and a federal force backed by a foreign force, but also by other powerful states against a tiny region which is also besieged. And that's an important, I think, distinction which we have to make. It is very easy for people to throw words around and say, oh, they have been defeated and all that. But clearly, people who pushed up to Addis, 200 kilometers to Addis, are not weak. Ethiopian defense forces, everybody who knows, used to be the most powerful army in the region. An army that can take the ENDF and destroy half of it is not a weak army. And so we must be careful against this very simplistic analysis, picking one element and saying it is the cause of the retreat.
Mm-hmm. To your point on what has happened in the last couple of weeks in terms of retreat, withdrawal, all that, what we saw is yesterday, Debretsion wrote a letter to the UN. Here is the condition for peace talks now, given that we have withdrawn from Amhara and Afar. Maybe we are just going to the end of the show. As much as many people and myself want to keep you here for a long time, but we will finish it. So this is what you posted, I think, January 3rd. It's an interesting observation where you say the Gulf is both a conflict generator and a conflict mediator. So given the Tigray forces are now within the Tigray, by the way, we shouldn't forget as well that Western Tigray and eastern part of Tigray is still not under the government of Tigray. But will the Gulf, I mean, the countries that are involved in supplying drone, all that, do you see them backing back in terms of coming as peace talk mediators, or do you see them, or will we see again, drones being continued to use within the periphery of Tigray?
Yeah. It's not a very easy question to answer, Getachew, because as I said, we live in a very changing geopolitical climate. Or first of all, militarily assertive middle powers who have the resources, but also now the military competence to intervene in conflicts. You also have a West that is feeling, that is beginning to withdraw or retreat from the Horn and other, the Middle East, or rather even the world. Also a perceived sense that the West is much weaker than it was, decades ago. So this is a very completely changed geopolitical climate. And so the middle powers feel they hold the cards and nobody can tell them anything. Just to give you an example, as soon as the war in Tigray erupted and the Tigrayans complained that actually the Emiratis were deploying drones, actually using them in the early stages of the conflict to decapitate the Tigrayan leadership. The Americans put a lot of pressure on the Emiratis and said, you need to stop this deployment of the drones. But that didn't cause the Emiratis to stop. They actually escalated it after the June defeat of the ENDF. So these countries have a lot of resources, a lot of the wealth. They are also big arms buyers themselves from the West. So they have the cards. So it is a very, there is a growing imbalance in power relations, which makes these assertive powers actually, control and assert their influence much, than it is the other way around. This is not to say that the United States and generally the West, Europe doesn't have leverage. They do have leverage, but increasingly we see that leverage weakening and weakening to a point where probably I would say it has become superfluous in the context of the Horn. Unfortunately, we have to contend with these new boys that are emerging, very aggressive, well-resourced. As I said, there is a potential that these people can be conflict mediators. But we haven't seen that, at least in recent months. And I hope that at some point there will be that strategic discussions by African states in particular of the Horn to see whether the Gulf can be partners with the regional states in devising ways in which they can stabilize the Horn. And I think the Kenyan government in particular, the Kenyan president, has been invested in this process. I know he has sent a lot of emissaries to the Gulf to say, can we meet and discuss these bigger problems and have a concerted approach. At the moment, I don't think we are there, but I have a feeling that this is a kind of strategic discussions the regional states should have with the Middle Eastern powers.
Great. Really last question would be, if I
Yes.
don't ask you this one, that would not be fair. So there are people who say that the TPLF brand, is it viewed as a liability in some middle powers or even in the Western countries? Is there a need for rebranding, or if you will, in terms of articulating what Tigray is for and what the TPLF, TDF is for, and so on? Do you see that problem, or is it just some, in the fringes in terms of the vitality of that issue?
I think it is a very important question, very valid, and it is, of course, for the Tigrayan people to look at those issues themselves and come up with a solution that works out for them. At this particular stage, I think the priority must not be anything else, but to see how peace can be found, how the humanitarian situation can be alleviated. And then I think transitional and bigger political issues can be discussed. TPLF definitely is a creature of its own history, is still powerful, has a lot of support in Tigray, will dominate politics for years to come. But I think even within the TPLF at least does not want to monopolize power. That is what I know in Tigray, and also their strategic outlook is to create a much more vibrant democratic system in Tigray, but also in Ethiopia. And because if the TPLF wants to democratize Ethiopia, wants to make it inclusive or demand, they cannot demand that, and then back home in Tigray they do the opposite. And so this is why I say TPLF is capable of change, knows the difficult circumstances their people are going through, knows the historic need for a review, and this is part of the tradition of the TPLF. It is a party that has shown a lot of competence actually in self-criticism and change. This is the tradition of Meles Zenawi.
Great. That was the show for today. Thank you so much for your time, and it's getting late where you are. Hope to get you back again for another insightful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Getachew, and all the best to the audience as well.
Okay, have a good one.
Okay, bye-bye.
You have been following UMD Media Show live on Middle Power countries in the Horn, Tigray as a lens, with the Horn Africa analyst Rashid Abdi. I'll be coming back tomorrow talking about the Somali cause movement. It's a new movement, and I'll be talking with people who know and who are part of the leadership, and we'll be live at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. So tune in for our show. Those who have been following us on YouTube and Facebook, thank you so much for your viewership. We would like more people to access our material. Please subscribe, share, like, so that YouTube, through its algorithms, can share it to many people. Today's show was that, and on Friday, we will be back with the Horn panel. We'll be covering what happened during the week, and we'll also converse on what comes ahead in the Horn of Africa. Each panel will be back at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, live on YouTube and Facebook here at UMD Media. Your host was Getachew Asafam. Bye for now.